Okay, so I guess we'll get rolling then. Hi, folks. My name is Aubrianna Snow. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a writer, educator, and advocate for gender-based violence prevention in school settings. Thank you so much for dropping in today. It's great to chat with you. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that this work takes place across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. I'm currently located in Treaty 6 territory, as I assume some of you are as well. And as a Mi'kmaq woman living as a guest in Treaty 6 territory, I think it's really important that we acknowledge our relationship to the lands that we're on and do what we can to improve that relationship and be of service to the lands that we're guests on and the people that live there. And of course, it's important to consider that gender-based violence is still used as a weapon of colonization today. And we have to acknowledge gender-based violence prevention work as a decolonial struggle. So we have half an hour together today, and I would really like this to feel a little bit more relaxed, like a conversation. So I'll spend the first 15 to 20 minutes-ish talking about issues around student activism and gender-based violence prevention. And then folks can ask some questions if they feel like it. If anything comes up for you while I'm talking, questions or thoughts, feel free to just drop that into the chat, or I can give you permission to unmute and ask verbally once I'm done talking. So for the past year and a half, I've been working as Stakeholder Relations Specialist with Possibility Seed's Courage to Act project. And oh, somebody is having a lag with the video. Sorry, I don't think there's anything that I can do about that on my end. I'll just try and go slow so folks catch everything, if that's helpful. So for the past year and a half, I've been working as Stakeholder Relations Specialist with Possibility Seed's Courage to Act project. And that was a project funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada to address and prevent sexual and gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses. So between 2019 and 2023, Courage to Act released over 80 tools and resources exploring gender-based violence on campus and connecting students, post-secondary staff and faculty, and subject matter experts from across the country on gender-based violence. And in this role, I've had the really wonderful privilege of being able to facilitate a lot of those connections. In 2022, I took part in organizing student leaders representing over 1.2 million students to create the Our Campus, Our Safety report. And that report presented 10 comprehensive calls to action for post-secondary institutions, provincial and territorial governments, and the federal government to address violence on campus. In fall of that year as well, I also helped lead the first National Consent Awareness Week, which has seen official recognition in 7 provinces and 1 territory. So that was really incredible to be a part of. And prior to my work with Courage to Act, I spent 2 years serving as Vice President Student Life at the Students Association of MacEwan University. And there I had the opportunity to develop and chair a committee on campus gender-based violence prevention. And I organized a number of initiatives to engage students and other members of the campus community on issues of consent and violence prevention. So as I'm sure many of you know, students in Canada have a long history of organizing for the issues that matter to them. Gender-based and sexual violence on campus is an issue that continues to affect students heavily, and we've really seen that reflected in the student movement in recent years. December 6th is both an opportunity to reflect on the progress that's been made, as well as a time of very deep mourning and reflection on how far we still need to go to ensure that everyone is safe on campus. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the student movement against GBV in Canada, some of the challenges that students face in advocating for their safety on campus, and how other members of the campus community can support students, as well as how we can build long-term sustainable work to address violence on campuses in this constantly shifting environment that we find ourselves in. So the history of the Courage to Act project, I think, is a great place to start with examining the student movement against violence on campus. But of course, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's been a tremendous amount of other groups, organizations, and individuals who've done some really amazing work in advocating for better institutional and legislative protections. Students for Consent Culture is a national organization doing also some really wonderful work to uplift student advocates and activists and empower folks who might have an interest in this work. And Action Now Atlantic also does something similar on the East Coast, and they've seen some great success in that region as well. So it's easy to think that student organizing for gender-based violence prevention started with the hashtag #MeToo movement in 2016, but that's not the case. Students have been doing incredible organizing work across the country since the École Polytechnique massacre in 1989, and even before then. And the landscape has shifted majorly in that time. And while a lot has improved for gender equality and violence prevention on campus, I think it's really never been more key that we act now to secure that progress and continue making campuses safer. We know that gender-based violence is one of the only crimes still on the rise in Canada, and campuses aren't immune to that, but we have the power to work against it. So, the challenges that students face in organizing for better institutional and legislative protections against violence on campus are many, but I see them as kind of fitting into two categories. So, one is related to the generally limited amount of time that students spend in the post secondary advocacy space, and the second is a kind of broader issue for cultural appeal. A lot of folks really still see discussion of gender based violence and sexual violence as taboo, unfortunately. Like I mentioned, it's been getting more attention in recent years, but there's still quite a bit of work to do before we can openly discuss not just instances of gender based violence, but also its roots and its impacts on campus and beyond. Shame and stigma still play a really big role in this discussion. And I think that that's something that we need to acknowledge, be mindful of, and work against. So, because students are mostly completing at most a 4-year program, turnover is a really significant sustainability issue in the student movement against gender based violence on campus. Um, Institutions who are being pushed to make changes to policy and services can choose not to. And usually, in a few years, the students pushing for that will have moved on and they are kind of free to move on without making those changes, which is not great. So, not being proactive and making the changes that students ask for has a real impact on the younger generation of students as well, because these issues don't end when folks graduate, as we know. The campus community keeps growing and shifting, and these problems continue to manifest. Um, but in tandem with the issue of shorter times on campus than other members of the campus community, like staff and faculty, I think burnout is also something that pushes a lot of student leaders out of advocacy. Many of the folks advocating for gender-based violence prevention across all spheres are survivors themselves, and I think that that adds a layer of difficulty to this work that might not be apparent to folks outside the movement. And aside from that, advocating as a young person in spaces that weren't meant to accommodate your needs, often folks' first entry into very bureaucratic spaces, it can be a real challenge. It can be just plain exhausting, honestly. And I've known a lot of student leaders during my time in advocacy who have had to take a step back for the sake of their health, which is right and good and more power to them. But also, that kind of widespread burnout does really have an impact on the movement. I think, particularly for elected student leaders, folks are often so burnt out by the end of their terms that they don't have the energy to complete a good transition with their successor or to inform and train other students on campus, really, in any capacity. And that's a real tragedy because the experience gained in campus advocacy is really so valuable, and students shouldn't have to start from the beginning every single year when those terms shift or when folks leave campus. One of the most effective ways to work against that reset, I think, is to build collaboration provincially and nationally so that there's a better collective understanding of the work that's taken place and what still needs to be done. This work is demanding, and folks engaged in it are often underappreciated and undercompensated if they're compensated at all. A lot of folks are doing this work in addition to full time classes, multiple jobs, and other volunteer and extracurricular engagements as well. And there's a lot that staff, faculty, and other folks in the campus community can do to support the work to address and prevent gender-based and sexual violence on campus. I remember when I was organizing that student committee that I mentioned on campus violence prevention at MacEwan, we had a lot of buy-in and guidance from MacEwan staff and faculty that really made that work easier. And having staff speak up on our behalf in meetings with administration really did a lot to build support for that committee and help integrate it into the broader campus structure and culture. So we were really grateful for that, and that power is tremendous. And the most accessible thing that almost anybody can do to support student activism is to uplift student voices and wield their own power to help make the changes that students are advocating for. And I think that's particularly true if you're a campus administrator, faculty, or staff member. The voices of multiple members of the campus community are much more powerful, much harder to ignore, and really generate change. It's a collaborative space, of course, so that change comes from collective work. I recommend seeking out and speaking with students on your campus who are doing this work. What support are they looking for from other students, staff, faculty, admin? Find out and help make it a reality. Even just allowing somebody to speak in front of a class for a few minutes or opening up your office as a safe space for a discussion can really go a long way in my experience. For people who are really involved on campus with student activists and advocates and folks doing this work, I think it's really helpful to facilitate some connections between older students and younger students. When I first got into my undergrad at MacEwan, I was introduced to some really wonderful, experienced student leaders, and it was so beyond helpful in showing me what was possible for campus advocacy and also developing my own capacities as a leader. And this is something that I also heard frequently in my work on the Courage to Act project. The student leaders have really full plates. So for those in elected student union positions, violence prevention is often just one of many things that they're working on. Opportunities to come together and strategize on sexual and gender-based violence prevention were rare and really treasured when they were available. And they're especially rare, I think, for folks looking to connect at that provincial and national level, like I mentioned, which is where some of the most important advocacy happens. We've seen that. So we saw that students are really craving that kind of dedicated space and opportunity for connection. And if you have connections to multiple campus communities, I would really encourage doing what you can to facilitate some connections between folks on those campuses doing this work. A lot of students don't ever get that opportunity to connect, and it's been so valuable in my experience to be able to strategize on that level and share in community, and also just not feel alone, especially for folks on smaller campuses. This work can be really isolating. So those connections are super important, and whatever you can do to help facilitate them is a great way to support the student movement. I think it can also be a really powerful gesture to establish your classroom or office as a safe space for student activists and organizers. So learn about support resources, both on and off campus, and be ready to share those with folks who ask. Encourage a culture of care and accountability in the spaces you host by learning about bystander intervention and teaching others and working together to establish expectations, not just in the classroom, but also in extracurricular and community spaces that you're a part of. And this is something that you can even do kind of casually with your friend group if that's something that suits you. It's just a really great way to establish some community agreements and work together to hold each other accountable. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks doing this work, students in particular, are doing so for free. So if you want to have a student leader speak at an engagement or be a part of a committee or working group, pay them fairly, pay them on time. Students are experts in their own right, especially on their own experiences on campus, and should be treated accordingly. Supporting students in advocacy, I think, for staff and faculty in particular, can seem complicated or potentially messy, but there's a lot of small, meaningful ways to support student advocacy that can be worked into your daily standard practice and routine, no matter your role on campus. And if you're not a member of your local campus communities, you can still support the work that students are doing. Following students' associations, unions, and other groups on social media and helping to uplift their asks by sharing and responding really goes such a far way. Oftentimes you'll see student groups pursuing specific campaigns, like maybe they're writing template letters to government or doing a hashtag promotion on social media. Those are really great ways to be a part of and support the student movement, even if you're not on campus. So those are great ways to go as well. I think there's also something to be said for contributing to a culture shift on campus or wherever you find yourself, again, in those community spaces. By holding each other accountable, speaking up when it's safe to do so, and living that culture of care and community, we can really start building a safer world bit by bit. And something I think about with this is in her book, Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown talks about the effectiveness of collective systems that we see in nature. And one example she gives is how geese fly together in massive numbers, just relying on and responding to the few individuals around them. And they kind of work in a collective in that way. And I think that's a really great metaphor for talking about ending violence as well. Systemic change really comes from our small interactions with the folks closest to us. And ultimately, support for students doesn't have to be some kind of grand gesture or very showy thing. Small ways of considering student needs and just making campus life a bit more accessible for folks really do a lot to improve the student experience for activists and for students who aren't involved in this movement as well. Building a sustainable movement for gender-based and sexual violence prevention is really essential. And I think we're seeing more and more the importance of holding the integrity of that movement. And eventually, we are working for a world where everyone is safe on campus. And that's something that will take everyone in the community. So whether you're a student, staff, or a faculty member, or an administrator, or even just passing through, violence on campus affects everybody, and everybody feels those impacts. We have a really unique opportunity right now with the momentum that's been gained over the past few years and all of the tremendous work that's happened to, I think, instill some real change. So I encourage everyone to think critically about your role in supporting students, uplifting advocacy, and preventing violence on campus. Because like I said, it is everybody's responsibility, and it will take everybody to build that safer future that we seek. By thinking critically about the movement now and doing what we can to help, we can all take part in building that safer future and establishing safer campus communities for everyone. So that's the end of my spiel. I would love to get some questions from folks. If folks want to drop those questions in the chat, or I believe I can also grant you permission to speak. Otherwise, I'm also online at aubriannasnow.com if folks would like to connect that way. Does anybody have any questions? Also totally okay if not. Okay, well, I don't see any questions. I would love to draw your attention to, like I mentioned, the ongoing work of Possibility Seeds. The Courage to Act project has wrapped up, but there's still some really incredible work taking place there for campus violence prevention, and a wealth of wonderful resources on possibilityseeds.ca for folks to access everything from discussion of processes of gender-based violence on campus, working with folks who cause harm, to student-created resources. I actually had the privilege of creating a resource for survivors on speaking with media, and that's in the Courage Catalysts resource on the Possibility Seeds website. So do check those out if you have the opportunity. And again, I'm available online at aubriannasnow.com if folks would like to email to chat, or if there are any questions. Oh, sorry, I just had a thing that I had to announce the Q of A. So hopefully you can answer questions now, although I think you should have had the opportunity to answer them in the chat as well. So I'll hold on here for a couple of minutes. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so I might just leave it there, folks. Thanks so much again for joining. And oh, somebody's joining me
here. Hello. Hi. Sorry. I just have a quick question. So I know that you work a lot with like university students, etc. And I think that in Canada, one of like our biggest demographic is international students. And I did catch when you were talking about like how to sort of like engage students, whether it's like in like student politics or whatever. So I'm curious, like when it comes to international students and engaging them in a sort of like meaningful way, making sure they're safe on campus, like what are your sort of like thoughts on that, or what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's such an important issue right now. International students are really in this kind of unique space, particularly when it comes to gender-based violence. I think a lot of times the impacts of campus violence on international students can be even more magnified than for domestic students, just because there are those questions of if I report, will it affect my visa status, things like that. So there can be a lot of additional barriers to folks in reporting gender-based violence for international students. I think engagement is really important and it's really key. And I think that that responsibility falls on domestic students in some ways who are engaging this work to ensure that the spaces that we're building are inclusive of international students and of their needs. So I think fundamentally, gender-based violence prevention, and particularly on campus, in my experience, is really like connection and relationships work. So, like for folks who are doing student activism, it adds a completely other lens to your advocacy to talk with different groups on campus, international students, Indigenous students, to us LGBTQ plus students, to really get a sense of what the actual comprehensive needs are on campus. And that can really advance advocacy in a powerful and meaningful way. And I think there's also some responsibility in terms of the institution itself to build those spaces where international students are able to connect and discuss particularly issues of gender-based violence. Because like I mentioned, those dedicated spaces are really, really lacking. So I think, yeah, my ultimate advice to engage international students is just to get out there and build some relationships and make some connections. And I think that's like universally true across the movement. I hope that answers your question. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful question. Anything else from folks? Okay, well, I'm happy to give you back 9 minutes of what I'm sure is very busy days for everybody. Again, do check out the resources on possibilityseeds.ca. Lots of wonderful stuff there. Check out Students for Consent Culture. I believe they're at sfcc.org, if I'm not mistaken. There's some really great resources there as well, particularly for students looking to engage. And I am online, most social media, just at Aubrey Snow or aubriannasnow.com. I would love to connect, love to chat, love to nerd out about campus violence prevention. So do drop me a line. And yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Walaliak, thank you all so much for joining.